Execution. The final act of state power. Irreversible, permanent, and deeply controversial. In 2023, across the globe, dozens of prisoners were led from their cells to the chambers where their sentences would be carried out. Some walked calmly. Others protested until their final breath. And each story left behind a trail of grief, anger, and unanswered questions. Tonight on Law and Crime Files, we uncover and examine all prisoners executed in 2023. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share to your friends and family for more law and crime documentaries. Capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, has existed for thousands of years. Once carried out in public squares before massive crowds, executions were meant to send a message of deterrence and power. In the modern era, though methods have changed, from the guillotine and gallows to lethal injection and firing squads, the debates surrounding the death penalty remain as fierce as ever. Is it true justice for the most heinous crimes, or an inhumane practice that belongs to history's past? By the year 2023, more than 55 countries around the world still actively enforced the death penalty. Some used it sparingly, reserving it only for the most serious crimes such as murder, terrorism, or treason. Others carried out executions in staggering numbers, often for offenses as small as drug trafficking or political dissent. Amnesty International and other human rights groups continued to monitor these cases, releasing annual reports that painted a sobering picture of just how common the ultimate punishment still is in the modern world. In the United States, executions have been declining over the last 2 decades, but 2023 saw several cases that captured global headlines. From Missouri's execution of Amber McLaughlin, the first openly transgender woman to be put to death in the nation's history, to Texas closing one of its longest-running death row sagas, the American justice system once again raised questions about fairness, equality, and morality in capital cases. Beyond America's borders, the year was marked by executions on a far greater scale. In Iran, hundreds of prisoners were executed, many of them political protesters or individuals convicted on drug-related charges. These hangings, often carried out swiftly and without fair trial standards, were condemned by international organizations as tools of fear and repression rather than justice. Saudi Arabia continued its controversial pace of executions as well, sometimes putting multiple prisoners to death on the same day, in what officials claimed was a fight against terrorism and crime. Asia also played a central role in 2023's execution narrative. Singapore, long known for its uncompromising stance on drug trafficking, executed prisoners despite mounting international pressure to abolish capital punishment for nonviolent crimes. In China, though the exact number of executions remains a tightly guarded state secret, experts believe the country still executes more people than the rest of the world combined. Japan, another retentionist country, quietly continued its use of the death penalty, carrying out executions by hanging, a method criticized as both archaic and cruel. Each of these executions tells a story, not just of crime and punishment, but of human lives shaped by tragedy, desperation, violence, and sometimes injustice. In this documentary, we will revisit the cases of prisoners executed in 2023. We will look at who they were, what crimes they committed, how justice was pursued, and ultimately, how their lives ended. Some cases are straightforward, their guilt never in doubt. Others remain clouded in controversy, with questions that linger long after the executioner's work is done. This is not a celebration, nor is it a defense. It is a record of final moments, last words, and the human cost of state-sanctioned death. From the echo of prison bars closing to the silence of a life extinguished, these are the stories of all prisoners executed in 2023. In the United States, executions are carried out less frequently than in past decades, but they remain a defining feature of the justice system in certain states. In 2023, 5 states, Missouri, Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, and Alabama, put prisoners to death. Each execution became a story of its own. Stories of brutal crimes, long appeals, questions of fairness, and final words spoken before lethal injection brought silence. Case 1. Amber McLaughlin, Missouri. January 3, 2023. The year began with an execution that drew international attention, the execution of Amber McLaughlin. At 49 years old, Amber became the first openly transgender woman executed in the United States. Born Scott McLaughlin, Amber grew up in Missouri under difficult circumstances. Accounts from her early life revealed trauma, instability, and a troubled adolescence. Her adult years were marked by failed relationships, run-ins with the law, and mental health struggles. In the years before her crime, Amber had transitioned, but still faced isolation and stigma. In 2003, Amber was convicted of stalking and ultimately murdering her former girlfriend, Beverly Gunther. Beverly, who had repeatedly reported being harassed, was ambushed outside her workplace, stabbed to death, and her body discarded near the Mississippi River. The brutality of the crime shocked the community, and Amber's trial ended in conviction. During sentencing, jurors deadlocked on whether to impose the death penalty. In Missouri, when a jury cannot reach a unanimous decision, the judge has the authority to decide. In Amber's case, the judge imposed death, a controversial detail that became the centerpiece of her later appeals. On January 3, 2023, Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection at the state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Her final words were delivered softly. She expressed sorrow for her actions and gratitude for those who had shown kindness. Outside the prison, protesters held vigils, many holding signs that read, "Stop executions" and "Trans Lives Matter." Human rights groups condemned the execution, calling it a cruel intersection of capital punishment and transphobia. For others, Amber's crime remained unforgivable, and the execution was seen as overdue justice for Beverly Gunther's family. In death, Amber McLaughlin's case continued to fuel national debates over both the death penalty and the treatment of transgender inmates in America's prisons. Case 2, Robert Fratta, Texas, January 10, 2023. Just 1 week later, another execution made headlines, the case of Robert Fratta, a former suburban police officer from Houston, Texas. Robert Fratta once appeared to live a model suburban life, a police officer, a husband, a father of 3. But behind closed doors, his marriage to Farah Fratta was collapsing. Friends described Robert as controlling, angry, and unwilling to accept divorce. In 1994, his desperation turned deadly. Farah Fratta was ambushed in her garage, shot to death in front of the couple's children. Investigators quickly uncovered evidence that Robert had orchestrated a murder-for-hire plot. He had enlisted 2 accomplices, one to arrange the killing, another to pull the trigger. Despite his attempts to maintain innocence, the case against him was overwhelming. Robert was sentenced to death in 1996, but his case wound through the courts for decades. At one point, a federal court overturned his conviction due to faulty jury instructions. Yet he was retried, convicted again, and resentenced to death. For nearly 30 years, Robert Fratta remained on death row, exhausting every legal avenue. On January 10, 2023, at the Huntsville unit in Texas, Robert Fratta was executed by lethal injection. Witnesses reported that he refused to make a final statement. At 7:49 p.m., he was pronounced dead. For Farah's family, the execution marked the end of a decades-long fight for justice. For Robert's supporters, lingering questions about the fairness of his trials remained. But for the state of Texas, one of the nation's most active death penalty states, the execution was a continuation of a long-standing practice. Case 3, Wesley Ruiz, Texas, February 1, 2023. The next month, another Texas prisoner met his fate. Wesley Ruiz, convicted of murdering a Dallas police officer in 2007, was executed on February 1. Wesley Ruiz had grown up in a difficult environment, entangled in gangs and drugs from a young age. By his mid-20s, his life was spiraling into violence. In March 2007, police officers attempted to stop Ruiz, suspecting him of involvement in a violent crime. A car chase ensued. When Officer Mark Nix approached Ruiz's vehicle, Ruiz fired a shot, killing him. Officer Nix's death devastated the Dallas Police Department, and Ruiz was quickly arrested. At trial, prosecutors painted Ruiz as a dangerous gang member with no regard for human life. The jury sentenced him to death. Over the years, his attorneys filed appeals, arguing that racial bias and inadequate defense had tainted the trial. But courts repeatedly upheld his conviction and sentence. On February 1, 2023, Ruiz was strapped to the gurney at the Huntsville unit. His final words included an apology to Officer Nix's family and expressions of love for his own relatives. He was declared dead at 6:41 p.m. For the law enforcement community, Ruiz's execution closed a painful chapter. For activists, it was another reminder of systemic issues within the death penalty system, where poverty, race, and inadequate legal representation often intersect. Case 4, Donald Dilbeck, Florida, February 23, 2023. Later in February, Florida carried out its first execution in nearly 4 years. Donald Dilbeck, convicted of murder in 1990, was executed on February 23, 2023. Dilbeck's life was marked by instability from the start. Abused as a child, he spent much of his youth in and out of foster care. At 15, he dropped out of school and spiraled into criminal activity. In 1979, at just 15 years old, Dilbeck was involved in the fatal shooting of a sheriff's deputy in Indiana. Sentenced to life in prison, he eventually escaped custody in 1990. While on the run, he stabbed and killed Faye Vann, a mother of 2, in Tallahassee, Florida, after an attempted carjacking. Dilbeck was sentenced to death for Vann's murder. Over the decades, his attorneys argued that severe brain damage from fetal alcohol syndrome and childhood abuse should mitigate his punishment. Appeals and clemency petitions failed. On February 23, 2023, at the Florida State Prison, Dilbeck was executed by lethal injection. His final statement was defiant. He criticized Governor Ron DeSantis and declared, I know I hurt people when I was young. I really messed up. But I know Ron DeSantis has done a lot worse. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. The execution drew attention not just for Dilbeck's case, but for the return of executions in Florida after a long pause. Supporters of the death penalty saw it as a victory for justice. Critics saw it as a reminder of the state's aggressive stance on capital punishment, even in the face of mitigating circumstances. By the end of February 2023, 4 executions had already been carried out in the United States. Each case revealed the complex web of crime, punishment, and humanity that surrounds capital punishment. And while these executions stirred debate domestically, the world beyond America's borders was witnessing executions on a far larger and often more brutal scale. Middle East executions in 2023. In the Middle East, executions are not just punishments for crime. They are often instruments of political power, control, and fear. In 2023, Iran and Saudi Arabia stood at the center of global concern, carrying out hundreds of executions. Some prisoners were convicted of murder or drug trafficking. Others were executed for protesting, dissenting, or belonging to minority groups. These stories reveal not only the severity of these states' justice systems, but also the human toll of executions carried out behind closed prison walls. Iran, the machinery of death. Iran has long ranked among the world's leading executioners, second only to China. In 2023, the Islamic Republic carried out hundreds of executions, with Amnesty International estimating that more than 500 people were put to death, a staggering number. These executions were often swift, sometimes secret, and frequently targeted political prisoners, protesters, or individuals from ethnic minorities. Case 1. Mohsen Shekari, symbol of protest. One of the most internationally condemned executions in Iran occurred with the case of Mohsen Shekari. Though technically executed in December 2022, his case reverberated into 2023 as a symbol of the regime's brutality. Background: Mohsen was a young man in his early 20s, living in Tehran. He was among thousands of Iranians who took to the streets during the nationwide protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman who died in police custody after being arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly violating dress code laws. Mohsen was accused of blocking a street and injuring a member of the Basij paramilitary forces with a machete. His trial was rushed, and human rights groups condemned it as a sham. There was no meaningful defense, and the outcome was predetermined. In December 2022, Mohsen was hanged. But in 2023, his death continued to resonate. Protesters carried his name, and his execution became a rallying cry against state violence. It was the first of many political executions in the months that followed. Case 2. Political prisoners and protesters. Throughout 2023, Iran continued to execute protesters at an alarming rate. Men like Majidreza Rahnavard and Mohammad Mehdi Karami were hanged after participating in demonstrations. Trials were often held behind closed doors, with confessions extracted under torture. Families were given little notice, sometimes only hours before their loved ones were executed. Videos of grieving families circulated online. Mothers wailed outside prison gates. Fathers begged authorities for mercy. Yet the executions continued, part of a deliberate campaign to instill fear and crush dissent. By year's end, Iran had executed dozens of protesters, alongside hundreds of others convicted of drug crimes or murder. Case 3. Drug-related executions. Beyond political cases, Iran executed hundreds of prisoners for drug-related offenses. Many of them came from impoverished backgrounds or belonged to ethnic minorities, such as the Baluch people in southeastern Iran. These executions were often carried out en masse, with multiple prisoners hanged on the same day. Hanging remains Iran's method of execution. Prisoners are blindfolded, placed on stools, and the stools kicked away. Sometimes these executions are public, with crowds forced to watch. Other times they occur quietly at dawn, with families receiving only the body afterward. International reaction. International organizations condemned Iran's use of the death penalty, especially for nonviolent crimes. But inside the country, state media portrayed the executions as necessary to maintain order and protect society. Saudi Arabia, executions as spectacle. Saudi Arabia, another country where the death penalty is frequently applied, also carried out dozens of executions in 2023. Like Iran, Saudi Arabia uses beheading, sometimes in public squares, as its primary method. The kingdom has executed people for crimes ranging from murder to drug trafficking, terrorism, and even sorcery. Case 1. Mass executions. In 2022, Saudi Arabia shocked the world by executing 81 prisoners in a single day. Though no single event of that scale occurred in 2023, the kingdom continued its steady pace of executions. Amnesty International recorded at least 170 executions that year, one of the highest numbers in recent history. Many of those executed were accused of drug smuggling. Others were convicted of terrorism-related charges, often after trials that critics said lacked transparency. In several cases, the executed were foreign nationals from countries like Pakistan and Yemen, raising concerns about fairness and lack of legal representation. Case 2. Beheadings in Riyadh. Saudi executions are often carried out by beheading, sometimes in public squares in Riyadh and other cities. Prisoners are led out, blindfolded, and executed with a sword. Families may or may not be informed in advance. Images and videos rarely leak out, but survivors and witnesses describe the atmosphere as tense, with security forces controlling the crowd. Case 3. The case of Abdullah al-Darazi. Among the notable executions in 2023 was that of Abdullah al-Darazi, a Shia Muslim from Saudi Arabia's eastern province. Convicted of terrorism charges, his case drew attention because of allegations that his confession was obtained under torture. Human rights groups decried his execution as sectarian and politically motivated, part of Saudi Arabia's long-standing repression of its Shia minority. Together, Iran and Saudi Arabia accounted for hundreds of executions in 2023, more than most of the world combined outside of China. Their cases varied from violent crimes to political dissent, but the message from both governments was clear. Dissent will not be tolerated, and crime will be met with the harshest punishment. Global reaction was swift. The United Nations condemned both Iran and Saudi Arabia, calling their practices violations of human rights and international law. Amnesty International labeled 2023 a, quote, dark year for human dignity. Protests erupted outside embassies, with activists demanding an end to capital punishment. For the families of those executed, the pain remains immeasurable. Mothers buried sons. Wives mourned husbands. Children grew up without parents. And yet, in the eyes of the states that killed them, these executions were not tragedies. They were acts of justice, deterrence, and control. As 2023 ended, the Middle East had once again proven itself to be one of the world's deadliest regions for capital punishment. For every name recorded, dozens more remain unknown, their stories hidden behind prison walls. But each execution leaves behind the same haunting silence, a silence that echoes long after the final breath is taken. Asian executions in 2023. Across Asia, capital punishment remained a tool of state power in 2023. Some countries applied it with unyielding regularity, while others employed it sparingly, but all defended it as a necessary measure of justice. Singapore, China, and Japan carried out executions that year, each case offering insight into different legal systems and cultural attitudes toward the ultimate penalty. Singapore, death for drugs. Singapore has one of the harshest anti-drug laws in the world. Under its Misuse of Drugs Act, trafficking certain amounts of narcotics results in a mandatory death sentence. This strict stance has long drawn criticism, but the government argues it is necessary to keep crime low and society safe. Case 1. Tanggaraju Suppiah. In April 2023, Singapore executed Tanggaraju Suppiah, a 46-year-old Singaporean man convicted of conspiring to traffic marijuana. His case drew international attention because of the substance involved, cannabis, which has been legalized or decriminalized in many parts of the world. Tanggaraju came from a working-class background. In 2018, he was arrested and later convicted of coordinating a deal to traffic more than 1 kilogram of cannabis. Prosecutors argued that phone records tied him to the operation. Tanggaraju insisted he was not directly involved, claiming he had only lent his phone to others. Trial and appeals. Despite doubts raised about the strength of the evidence, Singapore's courts upheld his conviction. Appeals for clemency were denied, and in April 2023, the government announced that his execution was imminent. Execution. On April 26th, Tanggaraju was hanged at Changi Prison. His family received only a few days' notice. Outside the prison, activists gathered to protest. International figures, including British billionaire Richard Branson, spoke out against the execution, calling it unjust and disproportionate. Singapore defended its decision, arguing that drug trafficking destroys lives and that the law applies equally to all. Critics, however, saw Tanggaraju's case as proof that Singapore's death penalty system is outdated and cruel. The execution reignited debates about whether nonviolent drug offenses should ever warrant the death penalty. Case 2. Other executions. Tanggaraju's case was not isolated. Throughout 2023, Singapore continued to execute prisoners for drug offenses. Many of them were foreign nationals from Malaysia, India, and other countries. Families often struggled to mount legal defenses, with language barriers and limited resources compounding their difficulties. For these prisoners, Singapore's uncompromising stance meant the noose awaited them once appeals were exhausted. China, the veil of secrecy. China is believed to execute more people every year than the rest of the world combined. Yet the exact numbers are state secrets. Executions are classified as national security matters, and no official statistics are released. In 2023, the pattern continued. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were executed, though only a handful of cases were publicly confirmed. Case 1. High-profile corruption cases. In recent years, China has increasingly used the death penalty in high-profile corruption cases. In 2023, several former officials and business executives were sentenced to death, some with reprieve, for massive fraud, bribery, and embezzlement scandals. Example: one such case involved Jiang Zhongsheng, a former vice mayor accused of taking millions in bribes linked to real estate deals. Though his death sentence had been handed down earlier, 2023 saw China continue to enforce such punishments as part of President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Execution method. Executions in China are usually carried out by lethal injection or gunshot. Families are often notified only after the execution has taken place, and bodies are cremated immediately. This secrecy prevents independent verification and leaves families little closure. Case 2. Drug trafficking and violent crimes. China also continued to execute individuals convicted of violent crimes and drug trafficking. In many cases, sentences were announced in public trials, designed to showcase the state's commitment to law and order. These trials often ended with the accused paraded before television cameras, followed by swift execution. International concerns. Human rights groups argued that China's opaque system, combined with a lack of fair trials, makes it impossible to know how many innocent lives may have been lost. Still, inside China, the death penalty remains widely supported, with many citizens seeing it as an effective deterrent against crime. Japan. Quiet hangings behind prison walls. Japan stands apart from its Asian neighbors. Unlike China or Singapore, it uses the death penalty sparingly. But when executions occur, they are carried out with extreme secrecy, and the method hanging has been criticized as archaic and cruel. Case 1. Life on death row. Japan's death row prisoners live in near-total isolation. They are confined to their cells for nearly 23 hours a day, forbidden from speaking with other inmates. They never know the date of their execution until the morning it is carried out. Families and lawyers are often informed only after the prisoner is dead. 2023 executions. In 2023, Japan executed at least one prisoner by hanging. Details were scarce, but reports indicated the executed man had been convicted of multiple murders. As is common in Japan, his name was released only after the execution, and little was revealed about the final moments. Case 2. Public opinion and legal challenges. Public opinion in Japan remains divided. Many citizens support the death penalty, particularly for heinous crimes such as mass killings. But activists continue to challenge its legality, arguing that the secrecy and psychological torment inflicted on death row prisoners amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Example: 2 death row inmates filed lawsuits against the Japanese government, arguing that the lack of prior notice before executions violates human rights. These challenges gained attention in 2023, though the government defended its system as both lawful and necessary. In Singapore, executions for drug crimes highlighted the clash between tradition and modern global attitudes toward narcotics. In China, secrecy continued to shroud the scale of executions, leaving the world to speculate. And in Japan, the quiet hangings behind prison walls reminded observers that, even in advanced democracies, the death penalty remains deeply embedded in law and culture. Each of these countries, in its own way, demonstrated that in 2023, capital punishment was not just about crime and justice. It was about control, tradition, and the state's power over life and death. In Asia, the death penalty endures. For some, it is seen as justice. For others, it is a reminder that even in the 21st century, governments retain the power to end a life in the name of law. And for the families left behind, the pain of these executions is a burden they will carry forever. Other regions and summary cases. While the United States, the Middle East, and parts of Asia accounted for the majority of executions in 2023, other regions also saw the use of capital punishment. These cases, though fewer in number, reveal the global spread of the death penalty from Africa to South Asia and beyond. Africa. Executions in a changing landscape. African nations are increasingly moving toward abolition of the death penalty. Countries such as Zambia and the Central African Republic formally abolished capital punishment in recent years, reflecting a regional trend. Yet in 2023, a handful of African nations still carried out executions, proving that the practice, while fading, has not yet disappeared. Case 1. Egypt. In Egypt, executions have remained common in recent years, often tied to terrorism-related convictions. In 2023, multiple prisoners were executed, though the government released little information about specific cases. Human rights monitors noted that many of those executed had been convicted in mass trials that critics argue failed to meet international standards of fairness. Execution method. Executions in Egypt are typically carried out by hanging, often inside prisons without public notice. Families are frequently informed only after the execution has been carried out, leaving little chance to say goodbye. For activists, these cases highlighted Egypt's continued reliance on capital punishment as a tool of state control, particularly against political opponents and suspected extremists. Case 2. Somalia. Somalia also continued to use the death penalty in 2023, particularly through its military courts. Several individuals accused of terrorism or affiliation with the extremist group Al-Shabaab were executed by firing squad. These executions were often public, carried out as both punishment and a warning to others. Though many Somalis see such executions as necessary in the fight against extremism, human rights groups warn that military trials lack transparency and due process, raising the risk of wrongful executions. Case 3. South Sudan. In South Sudan, executions were reported in 2023 despite international pressure on the young nation to move toward abolition. Details were scarce, but observers noted that prisoners were hanged after convictions for violent crimes, including murder. South Asia, Pakistan, and beyond. In South Asia, Pakistan has historically been one of the world's largest executioners, but in recent years, the number of executions has declined. In 2023, the country carried out a small number of executions, though official data remained inconsistent. Case 1. Pakistan. In Pakistan, at least one execution was reported in 2023, though others may have occurred without public acknowledgement. The country continues to sentence individuals to death for crimes including blasphemy, terrorism, and murder. Human rights organizations have expressed deep concern about blasphemy cases in particular, noting that individuals accused under these laws face intense pressure, mob violence, and, in some cases, execution. Execution method. Hanging remains Pakistan's method of execution, carried out in prisons. Families are typically allowed to meet the condemned before the execution, in contrast with the secrecy seen in countries like Japan or China. Case 2. Bangladesh. In neighboring Bangladesh, death sentences continued to be handed down, particularly in high-profile cases involving political violence or terrorism. In 2023, at least one execution was reported. As with Pakistan, human rights groups condemn the use of capital punishment, citing concerns over unfair trials and political influence. Elsewhere in the world, executions were rare but still occurred. Belarus, the only country in Europe that still carries out executions, reportedly executed at least one prisoner in 2023. Details were minimal, but reports suggested the prisoner had been convicted of murder. Executions in Belarus are carried out with a single gunshot to the back of the head, and families are never told where the body is buried. North Korea. Though impossible to verify independently, defectors and NGOs reported that executions continued in 2023, including for political dissent and attempted border crossings. These were often public, designed to instill fear. Yemen. Amid ongoing conflict, executions were also reported in areas controlled by different factions. These were sometimes conducted publicly, though documentation was limited. Aftermath and global reflection. Taken together, these executions outside the main regions remind us that the death penalty persists in many corners of the globe, even if it is rarely reported. In some countries, secrecy hides the true scale. In others, executions are public spectacles. And in still others, the practice continues quietly, with little international attention. From Africa to South Asia, the ultimate punishment remained in use in 2023, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes in the spotlight. But in every case, one truth remained constant. A life was ended at the hands of the state, and families were left behind to grieve. Though fewer in number, executions in Africa, South Asia, and scattered regions around the world in 2023 added to the global toll of death sentences carried out that year. And while some countries move toward abolition, for others, execution remains firmly embedded in the machinery of justice. Each execution carried out in 2023 was not only an individual tragedy, but also a subject of global debate. Across continents, activists, organizations, and governments weighed in, some condemning the practice, others defending it as necessary for justice and deterrence. The United Nations continued its long-standing opposition to the death penalty. In 2023, UN officials repeatedly called on member states to adopt moratoriums, citing the risk of wrongful convictions and the irreversibility of executions. Example: in April, after Singapore executed Tanggaraju Supiya for a cannabis-related offense, UN experts condemned the act, calling it a violation of international human rights standards. They emphasized that drug-related crimes, under international law, do not meet the most serious crimes threshold that would justify the death penalty. The UN's Human Rights Council also highlighted concerns about secret executions in countries such as China, Iran, and North Korea, where transparency is virtually non-existent. For the UN, secrecy itself was a human rights violation, depriving families of closure and preventing accountability. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and regional NGOs were at the forefront of documenting and challenging executions worldwide. Amnesty's annual report on the death penalty, released in 2023, noted both troubling increases in some countries and encouraging signs of decline in others. Key findings: Iran's sharp rise in executions drew intense criticism, particularly for drug offenses. The United States faced scrutiny for botched lethal injections and lengthy delays on death row. Egypt and Somalia were condemned for unfair trials leading to executions. Amnesty International reiterated its absolute opposition to the death penalty in all cases, calling it a cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment with no place in modern justice. Governments, too, were divided in 2023. Some defended the death penalty as a necessary tool for maintaining law and order, while others pushed harder than ever for its abolition. Defensive governments. Singapore's leaders argued that strict drug laws, including the death penalty, were key to the country's low crime rates. Iranian officials defended executions as part of their moral and religious framework. China maintained secrecy, insisting that the death penalty reflects the will of its people and deters crime. Abolitionist governments. Meanwhile, in Africa, countries such as Zambia and Ghana made historic moves by abolishing the death penalty, joining over 110 nations that have done so worldwide. In Latin America, most nations reaffirmed their abolitionist stance, with the practice confined mainly to authoritarian-leaning states like Cuba. In many places, public opinion remained divided. In Japan, polls showed majority support for executions in cases of mass murder, despite ongoing challenges by human rights lawyers. In the United States, support for the death penalty ticked upward slightly in some states, even as others continued to abolish it. Grassroots campaigns gained traction in 2023. Families of prisoners on death row in the U.S. organized vigils outside prisons. In Singapore, activists staged small but powerful protests against hangings. And in Europe, activists lobbied the EU to pressure countries like Belarus to abandon executions entirely. Perhaps the most powerful argument against the death penalty in 2023 remained the risk of executing the innocent. Exonerations in the United States, where prisoners on death row were cleared after decades, highlighted the fallibility of justice systems worldwide. Example: in Oklahoma, a death row inmate who had long maintained his innocence was granted a stay after new evidence surfaced. Cases like this reminded the world that no system is immune from error, and when the death penalty is involved, the error is permanent. Despite the persistence of executions, the global trend remained clear in 2023. The world is slowly moving away from the death penalty. Over 2/3 of countries have abolished it in law or practice. In the last 2 decades, dozens of nations have abandoned executions altogether. Encouraging signs. In Africa, abolition movements gained momentum, with several countries repealing capital punishment. In Asia, while executions persisted, public debates about fairness and proportionality grew louder. In the Americas, with the exception of the United States, nearly every country has ended executions. All prisoners executed in 2023 remind us of the immense weight carried by capital punishment. For governments, it is the ultimate assertion of authority. For families of victims, it is sometimes seen as closure. For families of the condemned, it is unbearable loss. And for human rights defenders, it is a stark reminder that justice systems, no matter how advanced, remain deeply human and therefore deeply flawed. As the world looks ahead, the debate continues. Will executions fade into history, or will they endure as a permanent part of justice? The answer, like the lives taken in 2023, will shape the moral landscape of our time. In 2023, executions were carried out on every inhabited continent. Each one ended a life, stirred debate, and left ripples of grief and controversy. The death penalty remains a mirror, reflecting both the desire for justice and the peril of power when life itself is on the line. In 2023, executions were carried out in dozens of countries across the world. Each case was shaped by unique laws, cultures, and politics, but together they revealed the continuing global struggle over the place of the death penalty in modern justice. The Americas. In the United States, the only country in the Americas to carry out executions, 24 men were put to death. Lethal injection remained the primary method, though states experimented with alternatives amid drug shortages. Each execution stirred debate about fairness, innocence, and the role of capital punishment in a nation that prides itself on democracy and human rights. Elsewhere in the Americas, the death penalty continued to decline. From Canada to Argentina, abolition was the norm. In Cuba, however, capital punishment technically remained on the books, though no executions were confirmed in 2023. The Middle East? The Middle East remained one of the most execution-heavy regions in 2023. Iran alone executed over 500 people, many for drug offenses, political dissent, and violent crimes. Saudi Arabia also continued its use of public beheadings and shootings, including the execution of foreign nationals. For these governments, the death penalty was presented as justice rooted in religion and law. But for families of the condemned and human rights organizations worldwide, it symbolized repression, secrecy, and cruelty. In Asia, executions highlighted stark contrasts. Singapore hanged multiple prisoners for drug trafficking, including the controversial case of Tanggaraju Suppiah, whose death drew global outcry. Japan maintained its policy of secretive hangings, carrying out at least one execution in 2023. And China, shrouded in secrecy, likely executed hundreds, though official numbers remain unknown. Across Asia, the death penalty was defended as a deterrent and a pillar of public order. Yet for critics, it underscored outdated policies and a lack of transparency. In Africa, executions were fewer but deeply symbolic. Egypt carried out hangings tied to terrorism-related cases, often after trials criticized as unfair. Somalia used firing squads through its military courts, while South Sudan also continued executions despite global appeals to halt the practice. At the same time, progress was visible. Zambia, Ghana, and the Central African Republic moved toward abolition, signaling a continental shift toward ending capital punishment. South Asia, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, executions persisted, though in smaller numbers than in past years. Both nations handed down new death sentences, often in cases of blasphemy, terrorism, or political violence. Critics warned that flaws in their legal systems made wrongful executions an ever-present danger. Europe was largely free of executions, with one glaring exception: Belarus. In 2023, it remained the only nation on the continent to carry out executions, using a method both swift and secretive, a single gunshot to the back of the head. Families were left uninformed, never knowing where their loved ones were buried. Other regions and secret executions. In North Korea, reports suggested executions continued, often in public, for crimes ranging from political dissent to attempted defections. In Yemen, amid ongoing conflict, local authorities also carried out executions, some in public squares. These cases, difficult to verify independently, reminded the world that in some states, executions serve as tools of control as much as justice. By the end of 2023, the map of executions revealed two realities. First, that the death penalty was shrinking. More than 2/3 of the world's countries had abolished it in law or practice. Second, that where it remained, it was often used heavily, and sometimes cruelly, by a small group of nations determined to retain it. Every execution represented a life lost at the hands of the state. Some were guilty of terrible crimes. Others were executed under questionable evidence, political trials, or laws criminalizing nonviolent acts. The debate was not only about crime and punishment, but about humanity itself. The year 2023 was a reminder that the death penalty is both shrinking and enduring. For some, it represents justice. For others, it is an injustice beyond repair. But for all, it is irreversible. Final line with emotional weight. As the world moves forward, one question remains. Will the death penalty fade into history, or will it continue to define justice through the taking of life? The answer will shape not only the fate of prisoners, but the moral character of nations. In 2023, executions were carried out across every inhabited continent. This was their story, a story of law, loss, and lives ended by the state. A story that is not yet over. Subscribe for more in-depth true life documentaries, and together, let's keep these stories alive.